More than 10 years ago, I visited Elmina Castle, on the southern coast of Ghana in West Africa. Though called a castle, Elmina is far removed from the beautiful, majestic castles of Europe. While touring the interior of this fortress, with its white exterior walls contrasting sharply with its sinister and dark atmosphere, I entered a space where an iron mass lay on the floor, about the size of a watermelon and shaped like a cannonball. It looked quite heavy. I asked a young man who had offered his services as a guide what this object was. The story he told me weighed heavily on my heart, and the memory remains vivid to this day. Among the young women who had been captured to be sold as slaves, one would be selected and chained to this iron mass and made to stand. The white governor would look down from the upper floor, and if pleased with what he saw, would command her to sleep with him that night. If the woman complied, she might avoid being loaded onto a slave ship, but if she refused, she would be put on a slave ship to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which meant almost certain death. Most women refused the order. And interestingly, one reason for their refusal was that, having never seen white people before, they regarded the white governor as a ghost. Today, I want to tell you about the sad and painful history of Elmina Castle and the Atlantic slave trade. The history of Elmina Castle dates back to 1482. This was during the era after Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator, when the Portuguese were actively expanding along the West African coast. Their reason for building a castle at this location was clear: gold. It was no coincidence that this region came to be known as the Gold Coast. Gold mined from the interior was concentrated on the coast, and the Portuguese wanted to monopolize trade in this precious metal. Elmina Castle served as their base and fortress for this purpose. In fact, the name Elmina itself comes from the Portuguese "amina," meaning the mine. For the first few decades, Elmina Castle functioned mainly as a commercial base for trading commodities like gold, ivory, and spices. But from the late 16th century onward, things began to change because of the sugar revolution in the Americas. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil expanded explosively, soon followed by tobacco and cotton plantations. These plantations required enormous amounts of labor. Initially, Europeans exploited Native American labor. However, as the indigenous population rapidly declined due to European diseases, particularly smallpox, Europeans had to find a new source of labor, and their eyes turned to Africa. Elmina Castle passed into Dutch hands in 1637, and thereafter began functioning in earnest as a center for the slave trade. The mechanism of the slave trade was surprisingly complex. White Europeans could have directly entered the African interior to raid villages and capture people, but such cases were actually rare. Rather, Europeans remained on the coast, and captives destined to be sold as slaves arrived through a complex network of intermediaries. There were various ways captives were procured. The most common was through intertribal or interkingdom warfare. Between the 17th and 18th centuries, wars for power struggles and territorial expansion were frequent in West Africa, and the victorious side regarded war prisoners as assets. In the past, these prisoners would have been enslaved within their captors' own societies, released for ransom, or executed. But with the start of the Atlantic slave trade, a new option emerged: selling them to European merchants on the coast. People who couldn't repay their debts were also sold. Some African societies had systems where debt resulted in enslavement, and this combined with the Atlantic slave trade. Additionally, people accused as criminals or political rivals were sometimes sold as slaves. The most cruel cases were kidnappings purely for profit. People working near villages would suddenly be attacked and dragged away. A more serious problem was that some African elites and kings actively participated in this trade. European merchants paid for slaves with goods such as guns, gunpowder, iron, cloth, beads, and alcohol, with firearms being especially central to military power. Kingdoms with more guns won more wars, obtained more prisoners, and sold them to buy even more guns. It was a terrible vicious cycle. The Kingdom of Dahomey, for instance, accumulated enormous wealth from the slave trade in the 18th century. And the Ashanti Confederacy also maintained powerful influence through gold and slave trading. Of course, not all African regimes participated in the slave trade, and some actively resisted. But the forces that engaged in trade gained economic and military advantages through their dealings with Europe. Most captives had to travel from the interior to the coast, a journey that could span hundreds of kilometers. Captives were chained together and forced to walk with heavy wooden yokes around their necks. They traveled 20 to 30 kilometers per day. Anyone who attempted to escape was immediately executed and displayed to other captives as a warning. The sick or injured were abandoned. It's estimated that a considerable number already lost their lives during this death march. The captives who arrived at Elmina Castle were now confronted with a completely different world. Many would have seen the ocean for the first time. Along with the endless expanse of water, what awaited them was a massive stone fortress. The architectural structure of Elmina Castle itself speaks to the power relations embedded within it. The upper level was the Europeans' domain, the governor's residence, administrators' offices, meeting rooms, and warehouses. The wide balcony overlooking the Atlantic Ocean received sunlight and fresh breezes and was furnished with comfortable furniture. It served as the place where accounting books were kept and trade contracts were concluded. Directly below, underground, were the dungeons, the prisoner holding areas. Men's and women's dungeons were separated. According to historical records and the surviving structure, each dungeon measured approximately 60 to 100 square meters, about 650 to 1,000 square feet. Yet 150 to 200 people were confined here at one time. The ceiling was so low that it was uncomfortable even for adult men to stand upright. The only ventilation came from a few small holes at the top of the walls. Sunlight entered only through those narrow gaps, so inside the dungeon was always dark. The floor was stone, and the walls were cold and damp. There were no toilets, so captives had to relieve themselves where they lay. According to Dutch East India Company records, the dungeons were not regularly cleaned, so excrement and vomit accumulated and the stench was overwhelming. Diseases naturally spread. Dysentery, fever, and skin diseases proliferated, and several people died every day. Interestingly, the Europeans didn't completely neglect the captives, because if too many died, it represented an economic loss. So they provided minimal food and water. Once or twice a day, a small amount of food entered the dungeon. The food provided was mainly porridge made from boiled corn or cassava, and water was given sparingly. The captives had to wait here until ships arrived, and this wait could last anywhere from a few days to several months. European captains waited until enough cargo had gathered to fill their ships. Generally, they loaded 200 to 400 people per ship. If they couldn't fill that number from Elmina alone, they also collected captives from nearby Cape Coast or other fortresses. There's a particularly noteworthy aspect of Elmina Castle's architectural structure: the passage connecting the upper governor's residence with the lower women's dungeon. Some historians argue this passage was intentionally designed to facilitate sexual exploitation. Sexual exploitation occurred extensively throughout the slave trade, and this was not an individual aberration but part of the system itself. According to various historical documents and oral testimonies, at fortresses like Elmina and Cape Coast, governors and high-ranking officials sexually exploited female captives. The method involving the iron mass I saw, chaining a female captive to it, while the governor looked down from above and made his selection, was both a display of power and organized violence. Let's return to the story about seeing white people as ghosts. This may sound like simple superstition, but in the context of the time, it holds very important meaning. Olaudah Equiano was born around 1745 in what is now Nigeria and was kidnapped at age 11 and sold into slavery. He later gained his freedom and published his autobiography in 1789, which played a major role in revealing the realities of the slave trade. Equiano vividly describes the shock of first seeing white people and ships in his book. I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Not just Equiano. Similar testimonies appear in various slave narratives and oral histories. Some Africans who saw white people for the first time regarded them as ghosts or evil spirits, because many people in the African interior had never seen white people before. Everyone they knew had brown or black skin, and suddenly beings with pale skin, strangely straight hair, and blue or green eyes appeared. They wore strange clothes, came on giant ships, and had cannons that made sounds like thunder. In many African cultures, ghosts or spirits were described with specific characteristics. Pale skin, beings from another world beyond this life, things associated with death. Seeing that white people took people away and they never returned, some Africans came to believe these were death spirits from the world of the dead. This was not superstition but a cultural response to trauma. When incomprehensible violence strikes, the human mind tries to explain it, mobilizing cultural tools, religious beliefs, and spiritual worldviews to find meaning. Indeed, some captives believed they were being dragged to a world of death beyond the sea. Some captives thought white people would eat them. There was a clear reason for this fear. What they witnessed was organized violence that their worldview could not explain. When ships arrived, the formal inspection and auction began. Captives were dragged out of the dungeons and would have seen blinding sunlight for the first time in weeks or months. They were taken to the courtyards or corridors of the upper level, where inspection took place. European captains and ship doctors examined each person carefully. They made them open their mouths to check their teeth. The condition of teeth was an indicator of health and age. They felt the muscles of arms and legs to assess suitability for plantation labor. They checked backs and bodies for scars or whip marks. Many whip marks meant a troublemaker and lowered the price. For women, there were additional examinations. Pregnancy status, childbirth experience, and reproductive capacity were evaluated, because female slaves were considered assets not only as labor, but also for their breeding potential. And as mentioned earlier, their value as sexual objects was also assessed. After inspection, prices were set. According to mid-18th century records, the price of a healthy adult male slave was approximately 12 to 15 guns, or equivalent cloth and metal products. Women and children were slightly cheaper, but women in good condition sometimes sold for as much as men. In the negotiation process, captains tried to lower prices, while European officials at Elmina tried to get the highest possible prices. Sometimes bulk deals were made. Buy 200 at once and get a discount. Once the deal was made, branding occurred. With hot iron, the owner's initials or symbol were burned into the skin. This marked them as property, the same method used for livestock. Now came the moment when captives passed through what's called the door of no return. This door is one of the most symbolic places at Elmina Castle. Beyond this door was a narrow passage leading directly to the sea. Captives passed through this door and were loaded onto small boats, which carried them to large ships anchored several hundred meters offshore. Large ships couldn't approach the shallow coastal waters. Historical records show that resistance often occurred at this moment. Some captives jumped from boats into the sea. Most drowned because they were chained, but they made that choice. In European officials' journals, these incidents are recorded as losses. Once aboard the ship, the journey known as the Middle Passage began. This was the most infamous stage of the Atlantic slave trade. The structure of slave ships was designed to maximize efficiency. The hold was divided into multiple tiers of shelves. The space between each tier was about 45 to 60 centimeters, 18 to 24 inches, barely enough height for an adult to lie on their side. Captives had to lie side by side with almost no room to move. There are records of an 18th century slave ship called the Brooks. This ship was about 30 meters, 98 feet, long and 8 meters, 26 feet, wide, yet reportedly carried up to 740 captives. The British Parliament later deemed this inhumane and created a law in 1788 limiting it to a maximum of 454 people per ship, but this was often not enforced. There were only a few small ventilation holes, and even those had to be closed in bad weather. The temperature in the hold exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, in the tropical heat. With hundreds of people breathing in a confined space, the air quickly became foul. There were no toilets, so captives relieved themselves where they lay. Excrement, vomit, and blood mixed and pooled on the floor. The stench was said to be beyond imagination. Records indicate that sailors on other ships passing by could identify slave ships by their smell. Diseases spread. Dysentery was most common, and people died from diarrhea and dehydration. Smallpox also spread, and scurvy occurred. Lack of vitamin C caused gums to bleed and teeth to fall out. Dead bodies were not immediately removed, so there were cases of lying next to corpses for days. The voyage took 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on winds and currents. To the Caribbean usually took 8 to 10 weeks. To Brazil was slightly shorter. According to historians' research, the mortality rate during the Middle Passage averaged 15% to 20%. This is just an average. On some voyages, 40% to 50% died. When storms were encountered, the voyage took longer than expected, or epidemics spread, the mortality rate rose sharply. Captains factored this into their calculations and loaded more from the start. They expected about 20% to die and adjusted the numbers so they would still make a profit. But the captives were not just passive victims. Resistance continued, and ship rebellions occurred. Historical records document at least 485 ship rebellions. The actual number was likely much higher, because small unsuccessful attempts probably weren't recorded. Rebellions mainly occurred when brought up on deck. Captains sometimes brought captives up on deck under the pretext of exercise to prevent them from completely sickening and dying. Captives seized these moments. The 1839 Amistad Rebellion is famous. On a Spanish slave ship heading to Cuba, Africans rebelled and overpowered the captain and crew. They tried to turn the ship back to Africa, but eventually arrived on the American coast, leading to a famous trial. Ultimately, they won their freedom and were able to return to Africa. But most rebellions failed. Sailors were armed and suppressed rebellions with guns and swords. Rebellion leaders were immediately executed, sometimes publicly tortured and killed in front of other captives. Nevertheless, rebellions continued. Looking at captains' journals, fear of rebellion appears repeatedly. Never let your guard down with the blacks, always be armed, check the chains daily. Some captains became more brutal with captives, creating a vicious cycle that increased mortality rates even more. Suicide was also a form of resistance. Some captives refused food. Sailors used a device called a mouth opener to prevent this, a tool to forcibly open the mouth and push food in. Some people jumped into the sea. Sailors tried to prevent this with nets, but couldn't stop it completely. Captives who crossed the Atlantic to arrive in the Americas went through another auction, this time the final sale. Major slave markets were ports like Barbados and Jamaica in the Caribbean, Bahia in Brazil, and Charleston in North America. When ships arrived, captives were examined again, but this time their condition was much worse. They had lost weight during the voyage, many were sick, and some were mentally broken. Owners of sugar plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco plantations, and coffee plantations came to make investments to buy slaves, work them on plantations, and make profits. There were 2 auction methods. One was individual auction, putting people on stage one by one and the highest bidder won. The other was a method called scramble. All slaves were given a fixed price, and at a signal, buyers rushed in and grabbed whomever they wanted. This was more chaotic and violent. After the transaction, captives were scattered to different plantations. They were separated from people who came together, people who were in the dungeons together, people they relied on aboard ship. This was another cruelty of slavery, intentionally breaking relationships, dismantling communities, preventing the gathering of strength to resist. The scale of the Atlantic slave trade was enormous. According to historians' estimates, over about 400 years from the 16th to 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. This is the number of people who were loaded onto ships and crossed the Atlantic. But the actual damage was much greater. When you add those who died during the capture process, those who died during the march to the coast, those who died in dungeons at fortresses like Elmina, and those who died during the Middle Passage, the total is estimated at 20 to 30 million people. Breaking this down by time period, in the 16th century it was about 2,000 to 3,000 people annually. It surged in the 17th century to 20,000 to 30,000 annually. It peaked in the 18th century, with 80,000 to 100,000 annually in the late 1700s. It continued into the early 19th century, and even after Britain's 1807 slave trade ban and the United States' 1808 ban, it continued illegally. Breaking it down by region, Brazil received the most slaves at about 5 million. The Caribbean region received about 4 million. Spanish America received about 2.5 million. North America, what is now the United States, received about 400,000. The reason North America had relatively fewer was that there was natural increase of the enslaved population there. Even for Elmina Castle alone, considerable numbers passed through. While there are no exact statistics, during the 18th century peak period, tens of thousands annually likely passed through this castle. During the 17th and 18th centuries, when the Netherlands controlled Elmina, hundreds of thousands probably passed through. The impact of the slave trade was far-reaching, spanning economics, society, and culture. Looking at the impact on Africa first, it was a devastating demographic blow. Young and healthy populations were selectively removed. People of working age between 15 and 35 were systematically taken. In some regions, populations stagnated or declined. According to historian Patrick Manning's research, without the slave trade, Africa's 1850 population would have been 50% larger than it actually was. Economic distortion also occurred. As slave capture became a profitable industry, productive activities like agriculture and handicrafts were curtailed. Wars increased, either to obtain prisoners or to prevent slave raiding, and social distrust grew. Fear spread that even neighbors or relatives could sell you. The impact on Europe was the opposite. Port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Bordeaux prospered from the slave trade and accumulated enormous wealth. Research shows that the slave trade played an important role in the capital accumulation needed for Britain's Industrial Revolution. Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery is a seminal work on this topic. The triangular trade system worked as follows: loading guns and cloth from Europe, sailing to Africa to exchange for slaves, carrying slaves to America to exchange for sugar and tobacco, then bringing those goods back to Europe to sell. Profit occurred at each stage. The Americas' economy depended on slave labor. Caribbean sugar plantations, Brazilian coffee plantations, and United States southern cotton plantations all ran on slave labor. In the mid-18th century, Jamaica's sugar export revenue was one of Britain's main income sources. The development of racism is also deeply connected to the slave trade. Initially, an ideology was needed to justify slavery. How could Christian nations enslave humans? The answer was, because they are inferior. Scientific racism developed from the 17th to 18th centuries. Skull measurements, skin color classifications, intelligence hierarchies. All of this was an attempt to prove the inferiority of black people. Of course, this was pseudoscience, but it was widely accepted at the time. This racism continued even after slavery was abolished. Late 19th century colonialism, 20th century segregation policies, modern structural racism. At the root of all this lies the racism of the slavery era. The history of sexual exploitation is also significant. As the Iron Mass at Elmina Castle symbolizes, female slaves were exposed to double violence, and where there's power imbalance, sexual violence becomes a tool of control and domination. The abolition movement began in earnest from the late 18th century, with Quakers playing a pioneering role. In 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was established in Britain. Testimonies from former slaves like Olaudah Equiano had great impact. The British Parliament banned the slave trade in 1807. Owning slaves remained legal, but bringing new slaves from Africa became illegal. The United States also banned the slave trade in 1808, though slavery itself continued. In the United States it lasted until 1865, and in Brazil until 1888. Even after the slave trade ban, illegal trading continued. The British Navy patrolled the West African coast and cracked down on illegal slave ships, but couldn't completely stop it. Even into the mid-19th century, tens of thousands were illegally transported. Today, Elmina Castle is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was listed together with Cape Coast Castle in 1979. Tens of thousands of visitors come every year. This place holds special meaning especially for African Americans. As part of Roots Journeys, many people come here to set foot on the African land their ancestors last touched. Some hold ceremonies in front of the door of no return, others meditate in the dungeons. The Ghanaian government operates programs like Year of Return to encourage diaspora visits. In 2019, a special event was held to commemorate 400 years since the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. But the politics of commemoration are complex. How should this history be exhibited? Should it be victim-centered or emphasize resistance and survival? How can we balance tourism revenue with historical authenticity? These questions continue. Some scholars criticize that Elmina Castle is becoming too touristified and losing its authenticity. Others counter that visiting this place itself has educational meaning. The slave trade has ended, but the racism and economic inequality it created still continue. The door of no return at Elmina Castle still stands open, facing the sea, and the round iron mass still keeps its place, silently asking questions about human dignity. Today we learned about the stories entangled with Elmina Castle and the slave trade. Thank you for watching. Subscribing, liking, and setting up notifications gives me a lot of strength.